When Google announced that they would be using their own processor, their own system on a chip for the Pixel 6 device, the Google Tensor as they called it, there was a lot of, what should we call it, skepticism perhaps from the tech community as to whether or not a Google-made processor would be able to stand up to the likes of the Snapdragons, the Qualcomms, or even the Exynoses of the world. Fun fact, the Google Tensor is basically a customized version of Samsung's Exynos processor. And while yes, the Pixel 6 did have its fair share of rough edges, it did eventually get, updated and patched into being a very, very solid device. And then with the Pixel 7, we got an upgraded version of the Tensor, which is the Tensor G2, and it was, like I said, improved a little bit. But again, as it's improving slowly, it already started at, maybe you would call it a deficit in raw power compared to the top flagship Snapdragons. And Snapdragons like the 8 Gen 2 have continued to accelerate that pace of advancement, and the G2 maybe has fallen behind a little bit in terms of raw performance. Now, I want to make something very, very clear here. When I use my Pixel 7 Pro and I use my Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, I do not feel as though one is radically faster than the other. The S23 Ultra is the faster phone by and large, but not by some massive amount. It's not this, wildly faster phone. So I don't necessarily think some of the criticism, let's call it, that the Pixels get for using the Tensor is necessarily warranted. It is a solid processor and it makes for a solid device. But for those people who have long complained that it is underpowered, today we have some news that might warm your heart and cheer you up a little bit. This is a tweet from Revegnus, who is quickly becoming an often cited tech leaker on this channel. Tensor G3, and there's a whole bunch of stuff written down here, and I'm going to do my best to reference a Twitter thread that I just made to break this down and tell you why it appears that the Pixel 8 and 8 Pro are going to be getting a whole heck of a lot more powerful with this new Tensor G3. So we have a whole list of sort of specifications here, and I'm going to try to abbreviate these as best as I can. And you're also going to note that Revegnus does not have, that's how that name is supposed to be pronounced, TechRev. They don't have the number of cores written here. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a minute. But at any rate, X3 at 3.3 gigahertz, A715 at 2.6 gigahertz, A510 at 2.2 to 2.3 gigahertz. Okay, so with the G2, this is what we had. There were two X1 cores at 2.85, two A78 cores at 2.35, and then four A55 cores at 1.8 gigahertz. This might be a little bit complicated, but the way to think about this is your system on a chip, your CPU has these different cores that are doing tasks. With the G2, there are two high performance, let's call them prime cores. Those are like the most powerful cores on the chip. There are two mid cores, okay, it's kind of in the middle. They're not an efficiency core, they're not a prime core. And then there are four efficiency cores. These are used for background tasks and things that don't need to be done super, super quickly, saves battery life, more efficient. That's why they're called efficiency cores. All of these things on the Tensor G1 and G2 are fairly old components, okay? So X1 versus X3 is what's rumored for the G3. The X1 is much older, than the X3. We also need to point out that this X3 running at 3.3 gigahertz is a higher clock rate than we see it in other systems on a chip, other processors. So that could cause the device to run a little bit warm. Now, the current Tensor chips are very good at what you would call sustained performance. You're gaming, let's say, you're exporting a video as this device hits, maybe call a thermal ceiling, as hot as it's going to get, is not hot enough for it to thermally throttle. It'd have to drop things down to cool off. Other phones might become thermally saturated and performance degrades. Could this be a new problem for the Tensor chips? It's going to have to be something we wait to see. Perhaps Google has some thermal designs in the Pixel 8 and 8 Pro to keep this from being a problem. Just something worth pointing out at this point. Basically, they're pushing this core harder than other companies have. Let's move on to some additional context. So the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is a very similar but also a very different layout, okay? They use one X3 core at 3.2 gigahertz. Notice we said 3.3 up here. warmth, what we're talking about. Two A715s at 2.8, two A710s at 2.8, and then three A510s at 2 gigahertz. So if we compare that to what we have up here, you can see there is quite a bit of crossover. Now, what we don't know are how many of each of these cores there are. I'm going to assume they're sticking with the same layout, which is 2 by 2 by 4. So we're going to get two X3s, two 715s, and four 510s. So if we do that, basically what we're saying is that the G3 is going to have not one X3, but two of them compared to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. At a higher clock rate, the same amount of mid-cores, we're going to get rid of those A710 cores altogether and then use 4 efficiency cores instead of 3. So they both still have 8 cores apiece, but they're distributed a bit differently, with Google leaning harder on the prime performance cores and harder on the efficiency cores, leaving fewer in the middle. That should bridge the gap between the Tensor G3 and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 by a considerable margin. This thing, the G3, comparing the G1 to the G2 was like a marginal upgrade. The G2 to the G3 should be a massive upgrade in overall performance. They are finally using like modern components that are going to be able to stand and go toe to toe with the components in other phones. And they're already competing with them very, very well with older hardware. With newer hardware, it should only logically follow that things are going to continue getting better. Now, we also have to mention that the Tensor G2 was manufactured by Samsung, but they were using a 5 nanometer process. This is going to be a 4 nanometer process, which should also mean this chip is going to get more efficient based solely on that. 4 nanometer is just a far more efficient process than 5. I think if you were looking for reasons to be excited about the Pixel 8, well, here's something to think about. How much better was the S23 Ultra versus the S22 Ultra because of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2? How much better might the Pixel 8 Pro be versus the Pixel 7 Pro because of this potentially massive leap between the Tensor G2 and the Tensor G3? Now, to throw some salt back in your eyes, unfortunately, the Pixel Fold will be sticking with the Tensor G2. And then only a few short months later, those of us that have the Pixel Fold will then have to watch a far better processor be launched in the Pixel 8 and 8 Pro. That's going to definitely sting a little bit. You can kind of twist my arm and maybe get me to say, man, maybe that would have been a cool thing to have launched with the Pixel Fold, but it is what it is. It must not be ready yet. Maybe they just have the Pixel Fold ready to go with the G2 and it just needs to be shipped out now. There are, I'm sure, reasons why the G3 isn't coming. But man, that would have been really cool to have the G3 in there to then compete against the Z Fold 5, which will have the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. It would have made for a much more even battle on paper, raw performance between these two devices. As I've already said on the channel, I don't think the Pixel Fold is going to be wildly slower than the Z Fold 5, but this Tensor G3 would have made it almost impossible to argue that there was a massive gap between the two. It is what it is, though. That's just what's going to happen, guys. Are you excited about this Tensor G3? Subscribe so you don't miss out on more content just like this. I will see you on the next one. And until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.